Well, hello and welcome to our Bible study this morning. We are going to be looking at the lesson 8 of our look through the book of Judges. And as you saw there on the screen, we're going to be looking at Judges chapter 6, verses 36 to 40. It's a very short passage, but I promise you there's a lot that we can talk about there, and we'll discuss a number of things there. The title is Fleece, Faith, and Followship. Last week, when I talked about last week's lesson, I ended up saying fellowship and didn't catch that till afterwards. Maybe you caught that, maybe you didn't. But we're going to be looking at a very famous passage, one that Gideon is most famous for, and one, to be quite honest, that causes some question about what we should do with this text. We'll talk about that as we move forward. But as we do, let me just ask you this question. Have you ever asked God for a sign? And when you did, was it a sign you prescribed to God in advance, or was it an open-ended request? What kind of signs did you request? And if it was open-ended, how did you know if or when you received the sign? Many times we seek God's will for the decisions we have to make in life, and there are some difficult decisions to make, to be sure. Some of the kinds of decisions we try to seek God's wisdom and will for would include things like, where will I live? Now, as a child, that decision is made for you, but parents make that decision. When you grow up, you get to make that decision yourself. You have a choice. Where are you going to live? What state? What country? What house? Who shall I marry? Should I get married at all? Where should I go to school? Or should I go to school at all? What classes should I take? What is my major going to be? Should I minor in anything? Should I go on to graduate school and so forth? What church should I join? A very major decision that you have to make as a believer. What job, what career, where will you work? A lot of these things are wrapped up together in one, of course. And then, of course, something simple like what kind of car should I drive? You could probably think of a number of other decisions that have to be made, many of which you pray about. Of course, you want God's wisdom and guidance in all the decisions you make. But when we think about other decisions regarding God's will for our lives, there are some very major decisions to make. Of course, that list could go on to describe any kind of decision that we need to make. Many do seek signs when trying to determine God's will and direction. And the question is, of course, is that the kind of thing we should be doing? Is seeking a sign from God or telling God what kind of sign to show you that will reveal his will? These are kinds of questions that come up. A follow-up question, as it directly relates to the lesson, as we'll read later. Have you ever asked for a sign after having clear communication from God what his will is? All these others that we talked about were questions of what God's will is. But have you ever talked to God about proving or demonstrating or giving you assurance about something you know he's already called you to do, or what decision he's already having you make, or what other, where you're supposed to go, what you're supposed to do? The question then is, have you ever, quote, put out a fleece for assurance of what God told you? And what was the reasoning for asking for God to do that? What were you lacking in faith when you did that? Question is putting out a fleece a sign of weak faith? We'll talk about that moving forward. We've heard the term putting out a fleece. Many people have done that when they've made decisions. I'll tell you about one in a moment. It comes from the passage that we're looking at, of course, today, as we'll read. I was once working in a job and was actually looking for moving up in a position that was vacated. And I made it known to my superior that I was looking for that position. And after a while, the superior came back and said that after putting out a number of fleeces for confirmation, decided someone else would get the job. And so someone that I know has used that as a reason for the decisions that they've made. Today's text presents us one more stage in the progress and process of Gideon's understanding of God. It records what many describe as Gideon's continuing lack of confidence, and we'll talk about that. It is the third of a 7-part mini-series on Gideon. Of course, we're looking at the book of Judges, chapters 1 through 8, but 7 of these lessons have to do with Gideon. Well, after we look at today's lesson historically, we have to discuss what process needs to be considered, what questions need to be asked, and what other things we need to factor in determining what, if any, action or response is necessary on our part to this text? What do we do with this text? Is it something that we are called to apply to our lives? And if so, how do we know? How do we go about doing that? We need to discuss what the text is trying to teach us about what we should know and what we should do. As we're getting started this morning, I want to remind you of the fact that we're in the book of Judges, looking at what God did through the various judges and bringing deliverance of the people. I won't go and give you a full background of the Gideon narrative. I do want to pull in a couple of things, though, to kind of put us back into focus of what it is that we're studying. So let me put up on the screen real quickly for you the fact that we are looking at the Gideon cycle. Remember, the people went into sin. They've gone under oppression to the Midianites, the Ammonites, or excuse me, the Amalekites, and then the people from the east. They've cried out for help. And now we are in the process of God providing someone to bring them deliverance from their enemy. And so as we look at this, what we're going to see is that the process involves working to get Gideon to kind of buy in, if you will. The angel of the Lord has already appeared to Gideon, and he's given him a sign already. Gideon has had acts of obedience himself, in which he has torn down the Baal altar and the Asherah pole. He's burned a bull on an altar built for Yahweh. So he's shown good sign. The thing is, though, is he comes into a position of being ready to go the next step in obedience. He's got some question. He's got some unassurance or lack of assurance. We're going to be looking at verses 36 to 40, but the text actually begins with verse 33. We read that as the part of our end of last week's discussion, but I think it's important to put that into perspective. So let me just give you a reminder of where we are. Reading from verses 33 to 35, we're looking at Judges chapter 6, verses 33 to 35. It says this: all the Midianites, Amalekites, and people of the east gathered together, crossed over the Jordan, and camped in the Jezreel Valley. The Spirit of the Lord enveloped or clothed Gideon, and he blew the ram's horn, and the Abiezrites rallied behind him. He sent messengers throughout all of Manasseh, who rallied behind him. He sent messengers also throughout Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they also came to meet him. So what we have here is a scene set. We have the enemy on the one side in the Jezreel Valley, and we also now have gathered a substantial army. We'll learn next week what the size of that army was and what the size of that army will eventually be. But what I want to get at right now is how much time is passing from event to event in getting at calling Gideon to the point where there is a battle. And so let's look at that. We don't know exactly how much time passed after Gideon tore down the Baal altar and the Asherah pole and erected that altar to Yahweh before this gathering takes place. We do know it takes some time to get the word out. He got his clan together, he got his tribe together, and he got some people from the other three other tribes together. At this point, there will be more coming in later in the battle, but it takes time for everyone to travel. So we don't know how much time is going to take to do that, but within the span of a couple of verses, we now have people on both sides, metaphorically speaking, ready to do battle. So you have the enemy in the Jezreel Valley, and you have Gideon and his army near the Jezreel Valley. We'll get more specifics as to where all will take place next week when we get into that lesson. The text then continues in verses 36 to 40 to what went on for the next 3 days. So narrative has slowed down. And we'll see in this text God being tested by Gideon asking for a sign. Let me read the text, and then we'll walk through it verse by verse and look at some details on what we think about, what we need to think about in applying it to our lives. Then Gideon said to God, if you will deliver me, or if you will deliver Israel by me, as you said, I will put a fleece here on the threshing floor. If dew is only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, I will know that you will deliver Israel by me, as you said. And that is what happened. When he got up early in the morning, he squeezed the fleece and wrung dew out of it, filling a bowl of water with it. Gideon then said to God, don't be angry with me. Let me speak one more time. Please allow me to make one more test with the fleece. Let it remain dry and the dew be all over the ground. Verse 40, that night, God did as Gideon requested. Only the fleece was dry and dew was all over the ground. Well, the text is pretty straightforward. What took place is described in pretty short order. Question then is, what do we do with this text? Let's walk back through the text, phrase by phrase, and at times word by word, to get at what's going on here. First, verse 36 again. Then Gideon said to God. What can we pick up from that? Well, the word then, we know it comes after there's a settlement of the armies facing one another. Now, they're not facing one another literally, obviously, they're close by. But what I want to point out is there has been this process of gathering. We've seen the Midianites, the Amalekites, the peoples from the east taking time to get in. As we said last lesson, probably that time of year when they would come in and try and ravage the land. And so they're there. Whether or not they're aware that Gideon is pulling together an army and they're going to face a battle is not known yet, but that will become known as we read further later. But I want you to recognize no specific amount of time has been given us that passed between him tearing down the altar, building the altar to Yahweh, and now this settlement. So what we have to do is think about what's happening next. Then it says, Gideon said to God, and we'll get the quote in a moment, but it's important that we recognize Gideon addresses God. Remember earlier, it was the angel of the Lord / the Lord who addressed Gideon, and Gideon would respond. Now Gideon is talking to God. Gideon initiates this conversation. I want you to pick up on this moving forward, and I'll bring it up a couple of times. I think it's key. There might be something to what we're about to say. Throughout this brief passage, at no time does God say one thing. It's unusual because prior to this, God's done most of the talking. And after this, God's going to do the talking. Here, he doesn't say a word. Well, what the rest of the verse goes on to detail in the verses after that is what we're going to call sign number 2. Now, remember, this is a two-part event that we just read about, 2 different signs. We've already seen a sign that Gideon had requested of the angel of the Lord prior, and that sign was granted. Of course, it wasn't necessarily the sign Gideon was looking for. He doesn't tell us what the sign is that he's looking for. When he brings the offering to the angel of the Lord consumes it with fire. And that's really the sign, because Gideon comes to know that the angel of the Lord is the Lord. But this is the second sign. It'll be in 2 parts. So we're going to call them signs 2 and 3. And then he'll receive a 4th sign in the coming lessons, one that he doesn't ask for. But this is sign 2. He says this: if you will deliver Israel by me, as you said. Now, what's going on there? I want to look at that first if, because what he's doing is he's setting up a contingency here. It's a test. If you will deliver Israel by me, as you said. There's the first contingency. The quote of what the specific request will be will come in a moment with another if. But I also want you to recognize that what's happening here is Gideon is calling on what God has already said to him. I know, Lord, that you have said you're going to deliver Israel by me. But if that's the case, the question is, why is he raising the question? He's already had affirmation here. He's been told. We'll look at that in a moment. But one author has suggested that this question that he's raising is not so much for assurance, but maybe hoping that God will change his mind. Now, that's kind of an interesting take, considering after everything else has taken place to get to where we are right now. Gideon is possibly asking, maybe God will say, you know what? No, I'm not going to do that after all. I don't necessarily agree with that view, but I do think it's an interesting one, simply because, as we'll see later, many times in the ancient Near East, a sign would be requested of the god for that very reason. And we have to remember that Gideon is a person of his time and of his place. And as a result, that has to factor into some of the things we think about in why Gideon does what he does. But the other thing I want us to pick up on is the fact that he says, if you will deliver Israel by me, as you said. That's going to be a very important point that we need to make moving forward. As you said, in other words, God has already indicated to Gideon that he would bring victory to the Israelites through Gideon. Remember, he said that it will be as if he beat Midian as one person. What are some assurances? What are the things that he said? First, chapter 6, verse 12, the angel of the Lord appears and says, the Lord is with you. Verse 12 again, mighty warrior. He says in verse 16 or verse 14, go in the strength you have and deliver Israel from the grasp of Midian. I am sending you. Verse 16, I will be with you, the Lord said to him. You will strike Midian down as if it were one man. And then in the passage we just read, verse 34, the Spirit of the Lord enveloped Gideon. And if that were not enough, we have not only the words of the assurance of God, we have the Spirit of the Lord enveloping Gideon. And now we also see in verses 34 and 35, he is surrounded by an army of his countrymen from his tribe, his clan, his tribe, and some of the northern tribes. We're sitting waiting for battle to begin. Everything is lined up even as God has said. So what is Gideon doing? He says, I know you said this, but I need to be sure. Verse 37, here is the test. I will put a wool fleece here on the threshing floor. Let's build on that for a moment. First, the wool fleece. Probably, an article of clothing. We don't know how big it was. We do know that it will be rather full of water here before long. But he's got this wool fleece that he's using. And we do know that wool will absorb a lot of water. We'll see what he does with that in a moment. But a key issue here, for all the criticism we may have of Gideon at this point, that we can make based on his request, we can see he has followed through so far in the things that he has been instructed. We also know that he's now at a threshing floor. Remember, prior to this, he was threshing wheat and grain in a wine press. He was hiding. Now he's actually out in an open area. Now, whether the Midianites can see him or not is hard to say. I think we're getting a feeling, though, moving forward, that the Midianites know what's about to happen. And of course, later on, when Gideon gets that fourth sign, we know that the Midianites know what's going on. But this is a positive for all the negatives that we can say about Gideon. And I think there's plenty of room for that as we look at this text. We can see that he's a mixture. He obeys what he knows, and then he questions more before moving forward. But he's at a threshing floor. He's actually in an open area. Well, he's putting out the fleece out on the threshing floor, and it says this. Here's his condition. If the dew is only on the fleece and all the rest of the ground is dry, let's stop there. The other contingency is the direct contingency. First was just a general statement. I want to put a test to know that you're going to deliver Israel by me, as you've said. Here's the test. If the fleece is wet, but the ground is dry. So that second contingency is extending the first one. The first if was simply opening up the request. The second one here is specific to what the test is. He says this, wet fleece, dry ground. This is curious. Not because it's more of a natural thing. We'll talk about that in a moment. But here, Gideon actually specifies to God what he constitutes will be the sign that God can use to tell Gideon he will be victorious. The previous text we looked at earlier in chapter 6, he doesn't say what the sign is that he's looking for. He just says, I want a sign. And we do know in other places in Scripture, earlier than this, after this, God does give signs to those that he commissions and wants to encourage. This one is unique, however. What he goes on to say then is, I will know. So let me read that again. If dew is only on the fleece, all the ground is dry, I will know that you will deliver Israel by me, as you said. Now, what I want to do is put a then statement in there. Some of your translations might. You have if, and then you have then. The then is implied, of course. If the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, then I will know that you will deliver Israel by me, as you said. So we have that implication. But notice what he says will be the result of this test. I will know. Now, again, God has already told him this. But now he says he will know. He'll have that added certainty. So I don't think that at this point he's trying to get out of it, but he certainly is making sure that this is what God wants him to do. And this is that God's promise will be fulfilled, because this is, as some translations say, not just as you have said, but as you have promised. This is the second time he's uttered this statement about Israel being delivered by me, as you said. That's important because it reiterates what we've already known. God has already told Gideon what is going to happen. He's already told Gideon what God's will for his life is in this moment. He's already promised victory. So Gideon knows this. There's no question what the plan is. There's no question what God's will for him is and the promise of victory. But he says, I will know this is the truth. I will know it that you have said it, and it is true. One real quick aside, we have seen God make a promise and follow it up with a sign. We see that in Moses. God calls Moses to deliver the Israelites. He says, the sign that I will give you is after you have delivered the Israelites, you will worship me at this mountain. So he won't even get the sign until after it's accomplished. We'll see later on Jephthah make a vow that if he is victorious, he will then do something for the Lord. That's a different kind of thing. But we also see God make a promise to Hezekiah. You'll remember later in the history of Israel, King Hezekiah, a good king, is sick and is about to die. He prays to God. We don't know what he prays. He just says, Lord, you know, I've been faithful and so forth. But Isaiah speaks to Hezekiah, and without Hezekiah actually making a special request, we do see that God promises Hezekiah 15 more years. And in order that the promise will be secured with a sign, he says that he will do it, and that the sign of God will be in conjunction with the promise. He's promised that he will have 15 years, and then he's given a sign that it will be done as he's promised. So we have a promise and a sign here. Interesting thing to think about here. When Gideon requests the sign, he tells God, this is what I want, and this will assure me that it is as you have said. God does not respond in that moment to Gideon at all. You would expect something like this: as you have requested, so shall it be. But we don't have anything like that. There's nothing except the narrative continues. I want to pick up on the silence of God at this point. I don't know that I want to overemphasize it, but in light of the overall conversation that takes place between Gideon and God throughout these 3 chapters, it is curious that we have silence from God here. One author has also suggested that the narrative refers to God simply as God in this passage, where in other places in the narrative, he's referred to as Yahweh, the Lord, which is more covenant name, more personal idea behind talking to the Lord. Here it's just God. God said, God did that. We would think that God would have said something, but he doesn't. The question is then, is that silence something for us to think about in regard to what God thinks of Gideon's request? Well, verse 38 says very simply, and this is what happened. Gideon requests that the fleece be wet, the ground be dry. The narrator tells us at the beginning of verse 38, and that is what happened. Now, just stop and reflect on that for a moment. Just think. The narrator says it happened exactly as Gideon had requested. Nothing more really needs to be said. He could have moved on and said something like, a word of thanksgiving we'll talk about in a second. It could have been that God could have responded, but nothing. But that pretty much sums it up. It happened just as Gideon had requested. But the narrator goes further. He makes the general statement that the request was fulfilled even as it was made. But he goes on to tell us exactly what happened. So it's a little bit redundant, but I think that emphasis is needed. He goes on in verse 38 to say, when he got up early in the morning, he squeezed the fleece and wrung dew out of it, filling a bowl with water. So quite a bit of water. It is early in the morning. So this did happen overnight. So we've had day 1, the request. Day 2, wakes up and he sees the request fulfilled. It is assumed that the ground was dry as Gideon requested, because he says that is what happened. We do know a couple things. The fleece was wet, the ground was dry. The ground, the threshing floor would have been dirt and some kind of stone or rock, okay? So that's important to note, because what we're seeing then is Gideon making a request that really is just kind of a natural event. Anything like grass or something wool like that fleece would have absorbed any of the water around it overnight, but the ground would have quickly evaporated. Now, to give Gideon some benefit of the doubt here, the author does say that it was early in the morning. And so the question is, could there have been water on the ground early in the morning? We know that dew forms from the moisture and the cool of the air. And at times you get up early enough in the morning, you can see the sidewalks and the streets are wet from the dew. And that could have happened here. It's early in the morning. We don't know how early. It could be before the sun came up and the water started to evaporate in the heat. But what we do see here is that we have, just as Gideon requested, we have a wet fleece and we have dry ground. Not only do we have a wet fleece, we have a sopping wet fleece. We have one that when Gideon wrings out the water, it fills a bowl. We don't know what size the bowl was, but it was enough that the author would make a comment about it. And so we're told this was a significant amount of water. So maybe not only does God fulfill the sign request, but he does it in abundance. Again, he hasn't spoken yet. So we have a summary then of the first request, which we're calling sign 2. Gideon receives the confirmation that he has sought. He said, if you put dew on the fleece, but the ground is dry, then I will know that you are going to deliver Israel by my hand, as you said. He said that twice in this request. But that one sign apparently was not enough, because as we read on, he makes a second request. This is going to be the second request in the sign scene. It's the third sign. So what's going on here? Verse 39. Gideon then said to God, well, there we have it again. God doesn't speak. We have Gideon speaking again, but notice what it is. As we'll see in a moment, it's not a word of praise. It's not a word of thanksgiving. It's not a word of assurance or acknowledgement or confirmation that he's going to know that God is going to use him to deliver Israel. Remember, he said, if you do this, I will know. But he doesn't do that. And I don't think it would be unreasonable to expect Gideon to say, now I know. We have other texts in scripture that does that. But he doesn't say, now I know. In fact, he doesn't go anywhere near acknowledging that it was done, other than to move on to the next request. God is silent. Only Gideon is speaking. And what he's about to say doesn't line up with what we would have expected him to say. What he does is he offers up a second petition, or a petition, I should say, and a repetition of his request. Notice what he says further on in the verse. We're looking at verse 39. He goes on to say, don't be angry with me. Let me speak one more time. First, the words, don't be angry. This could be Gideon acting in relation to God, as would be expected that he would act toward Baal. We'll see a little bit more possibility of this relationship between Gideon and Baal playing into this request in a moment. But he's certainly saying, don't be angry. Maybe he's playing into the way he did relate to Baal, in that many of the Canaanites were afraid of their gods. They served their gods, but they feared their gods. And certainly now in this conversation, he's about to make a request. He could be thinking God is something like Baal. His own worshipers, Baal's own worshipers, would have feared him. We will talk about this request in light of Gideon's old worldview a little bit in a moment. But I do think it's important for us to recognize that first word, don't be angry with me. It could simply be a preemptive move, of course, knowing that he's going to ask for another request. So it's just a politeness, who knows, a nicety, a kind of a matter of etiquette. Does he know the character of God well enough at this point, though, to assume that God would become angry? Or is he simply being reactive based on his previous religion with Baal that we just mentioned? Why is he saying, don't be angry? We know this much, that there was another time in the history of Israel, and Abraham makes a similar request and asks again for a sign. He goes on in the rest of the verse, Gideon does, and says, let me speak one more time. And this does match up similar to what we have in Genesis chapter 18, verse 32, when Abraham is kind of having this conversation with God about whether or not to destroy the city of Sodom. And what you have here is Gideon, or Abraham, in his conversation with God, speaking, and then he says, let me speak one more time. And so we see a parallel there. Does Gideon know this? It's hard to say. He might have known this through oral tradition. Don't know that he's got a copy of the Pentateuch or any of the earliest books of the Old Testament with him. And we know that he and his father, and maybe even generation prior to that, were worshiping Baal. So what does he know about God at this point? And that may play in to why he's talking to God the way he does. But he says, let me speak one more time. And as he does, he makes the second request. Please allow me to make one more test with the fleece. It is a test using the same kind of item, a fleece. Now, some have suggested it was a different fleece. It's the same day. Maybe that fleece hasn't dried out. We don't know. One author has used the word fleeces in the plural, which is kind of interesting. But he does say, let me do one more test with the fleece. Notice he doesn't change the items. He doesn't change the test, so to speak. He keeps the same item. But Here's important to note what we've just heard from him. Gideon is not being true to his own word. Remember, he said earlier, if you will do this, then I will know. But apparently he doesn't know for sure, or if he does, he's really pressing the issue because he's not staying true to his word. He's going further. He said he would know that the Lord was going to deliver or save Israel by his hand after the first sign. And yet here he is asking again. It is an interesting take on Gideon's part here, not knowing all there is to know about God yet, and yet he's asking God these questions. Twice then he has acknowledged that God had already promised victory, and he's offering up his own word. He had offered up his own word, I will know, but he does not affirm that. Again, God is silent on this issue. His next request then will be more difficult and something that will be more convincing. He says, let it remain dry. In other words, let the fleece remain dry and the dew all around, the dew be all around the fleece on the ground. Let me read that again. Let it remain dry and the dew be all over the ground. Yes, this is completely opposite. This is something impossible, perhaps, with the ground being wet, especially the dirt and the stone or the rocky ground being wet while the fleece is dry, because we know the nature of the fleece would be to sop up or to soak up and absorb all that liquid. But what we find in verse 40, that night God did as Gideon requested. What we see then, the author mentions, is only the fleece was dry and the dew was all over the ground. So as before, the author gives us a general statement of fulfillment. In other words, it happened just like Gideon had requested. And then you have the second statement. The specific statement was just as he had requested. The fleece was dry, the ground was wet. So God responded. Notice he doesn't speak, but he acts. God did it. Now, the first time it says it was as, and it happened that way. Here we have direct word that it was God that did it. Do we make something of that? I don't know. I do think it's important we take the time to look at each text very carefully at this point to know how the progression is building. But then that's it. Think about that. We're at the end of verse 40. We still have a little bit more ways to go, as you can tell by the timer on your screen. The text stops there. That's it. What we don't have is God speaking again. He doesn't say, see, I've done this for you twice. We don't have Gideon responding at all. There is still no now I know statement. The narrative doesn't tell us. Now, in your Bible, of course, verse 40 is the last verse in chapter 6. Chapter 7 is going to pick up with the narrative a little bit later and preparing for battle. And what we're going to see is God then challenge Gideon further. But there's no word of conclusion to this matter. But apparently it's his action that's going to be more important than his words. Gideon is going to follow through. So as the reader must go on with the text to see what happens next, we'll wait till next week to see specifically what happens next. Until then, there is this matter of the meaning of this text for us today. So questions like this: what do we do with this text? What do we do with Gideon in this narrative? We know that the Bible is for all people for all time. We know that the Bible is there to teach us. The question is, what do we do with specific passages like this? We've seen what the text said and what Gideon did, but we have to ask ourselves, what did it mean in the time that it was written? What did it mean for the people that originally read it? What was it meaning for their time? What then does it mean for us in our time? Let's think of some things along the way, some details to consider. First, this question: why is Gideon doing this? Is there some background information that could help us understand? So let's talk about Gideon for a moment. Yes, clearly this is a faith issue, and I think many scholars are right. In fact, I'll say it now. I was going to save this for later. I have found nothing that praises Gideon for this action. Everything that I've read, from the blogs to the commentaries to the sermons and so forth, Gideon is looked down upon because of this request. He is lacking faith. He is lacking assurance. And that is seen as a negative here. He's already been given signs. He's already been given reassurance. And so in this event, it's very clear that he's lacking faith. Now, the question is that warranted? In other words, is the criticism warranted? I want to give a little bit more balance at this point and give some information that might help us understand where he's coming from without excusing him. But clearly there's an issue of faith here. The question is why? Why is there a question of faith? Well, consider this. In his own personal life, he's going through a paradigm shift. He has been worshiping Baal. Whatever knowledge he's had of Yahweh is a distant knowledge. His own father was a leader in the worship of Baal in his own town. Gideon grew up basically worshiping Baal. And we don't know how far back in their history they did that. We don't know how many generations into the time of the judges this is. We know it's at least 2, because we're talking about this coming after the time of Deborah. So as he's being reacquainted with Yahweh, he is entering into a new relationship. And so he has been obedient to what God has told him up to this point. He's torn down the altar. He's torn down the Asherah pole. He's built a new altar to Yahweh. He's burned a sacrifice on it. He has done everything up to this point. He's gathered an army. So we know he's being obedient to what it is that he does know, but it's still something new. There's also the possibility that he doesn't know exactly how to relate to this God. He's learning that this God is the real God, and he's been doing what God wants him to do. So the question might be something like this. Is there room for a little leeway and grace for such a person who's in the infancy stages of this faith? Again, it may be a renewal of acquaintances, but it's not something that's been personal to him. Should more be expected had he been more mature in the faith? Remember, God is calling someone who's been worshiping Baal. He is an Israelite by tradition, not by tradition, but by heritage, by ethnicity, by tribal acquaintance and tribal loyalty and origin. But that doesn't mean he's been worshiping Yahweh. Here is a person who is having a complete shift, and he may be looking at God still through his Baal eyes. What we need to see, though, is he is progressing. However, I still think that there is room for some criticism here. He then asked for a sign in general. So here's a person who's been worshiping Baal, and now concerning his request for the sign in general, let's talk about this for a moment. It's possible that Gideon was engaging God as he would have done, as would have been typical of any pagan practice in the ancient world. He's practicing what many call divination. Divination took on many forms in the ancient world. Sometimes it was looking at sticks on the ground, how they were laying. Sometimes it would look at the lines in a piece of liver. But all those are kind of passive. Here, Gideon is making a more active request by telling God what that particular sign is to be. But still, he is trying to use divination of a kind to get from God information. And that would have been a common practice in the ancient world. So it seems like while he's got this newfound relationship with God, he's still kind of in the old world, old religion, if you will. Gideon is still learning to know the ways of this God. And as such, God accommodates Gideon's request, not because that's the way God works, that's important to say, but because this is what Gideon is still learning, or Gideon is still in the learning stages. God did things for people that weren't necessarily the best, but he did. He accommodated them by giving them a king. That wasn't the best. There are other times we see God working here. I think what God is doing is accommodating Gideon, given where Gideon is coming from. He's still looking at Yahweh from Baal-colored glasses, but he needs to get his Yahweh-colored glasses on. Chapter 8, we'll see later that after victory does come, he does kind of roll back into that old way. We'll talk about that later after we look at some intervening chapters. But it's important to note, this is a continual struggle for Gideon. So there is the question or the issue of asking for a sign in general. But now there might be something to think about with regard to the specific kind of sign that he requests. Why fleece and dew? Why a wet fleece? Could it be, and I think it is, that this is also a cultural or religious issue? Gideon could have had any number of signs requested. He could have asked for the sky to turn dark. He could have asked for rain to fall, which would have played into this event anyway. But he could have asked for any number of signs. But he asked specifically regarding dew. Could there be something in his worship of Baal or in the religion of Baal that is significant here? Remember, God told him to tear down the Baal and the Asherah, build an altar to Yahweh. The people were concerned about this and thought that Gideon should die. But Joash, Gideon's father, comes in the picture and says Baal can defeat or take care of Gideon himself if he wants to, but he doesn't. So there's some direct attack at Baal worship at this point. Gideon is going to learn something about Yahweh here. Gideon tests God to show himself. In other words, he's getting God to show who he himself is, and specifically, is he greater than Baal? And you're wondering, how in the world did this happen with the fleece? Well, what we know about Baal in the ancient world is, one, he was the god of the storm. He was a warrior god. He was the god of the storm. And also, he was responsible for, here we come, dew and rain. One ancient text reads this way about Baal: the absence of Baal from the world results in no dew, no downpour, no swirling of the deeps, no welcome voice of Baal to break the sweltering heat. One text goes on to say that Baal had a daughter named Talia, or Talia, Talia. What's curious about that is she would be the one to bring the dew as an intermediary for Baal. The Hebrew word for dew is tal. One of the things that might be going on here is that in his test of God, seeking a word of assurance, one part of that test is, I know we've already torn down the altar to Baal, but can you do what Baal did? And what we see here is he is asking for a sign such that Yahweh can demonstrate that Yahweh is the real God and that Baal is no God, especially when you couple that with what we see in tearing down the altar to Baal, and he does nothing about it. Remember later in the time of Elijah, we mentioned this in a previous lesson, that Elijah fought the prophets of Baal, and they built an altar, and the challenge was for Baal to destroy it, send fire down. He doesn't, but Yahweh does. And that's evidence further that Yahweh does not exist. Unfortunately, the problem is centuries passed between Gideon and Elijah, and still there is the worship of Baal on and off again in the history of Israel. But there are two bookmark or bookend statements about Baal's non-existence by his not coming to his own defense, if you will. What we have then is something like this. Baal brings the dew, but this time God did it, not Baal. Baal did not act because Baal does not exist. We're getting a word of assurance for Gideon that will help him recognize that he is following Yahweh, and Yahweh will bring victory because he is stronger than Baal, because Baal does not exist. God determined that the stopping, God it was who determined the stopping and the coming of the rain, not Baal. And so we see that in specific example I can give you is 1 Kings chapter 17, when you look back at the story of Elijah there. Gideon now then is going through various stages of faith. Here we see him operating in relationship to God via his old worldview. He asked for a sign. That's an old worldview way of communicating with the God. He asked for a specific sign. That's an old worldview way of dealing with his specific God. We're seeing him move forward. Now, again, I want to balance the proper criticism here, but also recognize where Gideon's coming from. And there might be a number of other things to say about that for people who do convert from other faiths to the Christian faith. Not to the extent that they're going to need to fight for God in some battle, but certainly there are those who come to Christianity out of other faiths and still see things until they grow more with the old worldview. Other things to consider about making possible application. We always have to look at what the text says. And here's what the text says. God grants both requests. Now, it's important to recognize that he grants the request doesn't mean he's endorsing the practice that Gideon is participating in. Essentially, what God is doing here, though, is saying, okay, Gideon, if that's going to help you. Now, again, I'm inferring that because God in this few verses speaks no words at all. He doesn't say one word, but he gives the signs that are requested. So what we see here is his doing what Gideon asked, but that doesn't mean this is the typical way of asking. In fact, one scholar has suggested this is the first time anyone in the Bible has requested a sign from God. Now, a specific sign like this, I know if you want to go back to Abraham, Abraham is bartering with God about Sodom, and he goes, well, if you found this many righteous people, then this many. He keeps going lower and lower. Of course, that is never met because the criteria are never met. God does give signs in many places in the Old Testament before and after. But how many tell God what specific sign to perform in order to show that he's going to do what he's going to do? This is not necessarily an endorsement. This demonstrates God will do it when he desires to do it, but he certainly doesn't do it just because it's asked. We do know later in the New Testament, both Jesus and Paul speak rather negatively of those who request a sign or demand a sign. And here we see at least God acquiescing, if you can use that word. So what the text says is simply God did it. What the text does not say, there are many things the text does not say. It doesn't say at all that he spoke. We've already made more of a case of that than probably needs to be made, but I want you to catch that. God doesn't speak at all. He only acts. Prior to this and after this, God and Gideon are going to have dialogue. There's only monologue here. There's only Gideon talking. So I do raise the question, as much as I've made the point, is it significant that God does not talk here? The text then does not praise Gideon for this request, nor does it condemn him for the request. The text merely reports it. And that's important when we consider whether we're supposed to follow that example or not. All the author does is report. We'll talk about distinguishing prescriptive and descriptive historical text in a moment. But right now, we don't have a praise for Gideon. We don't have a condemnation of Gideon. Also, what we don't have, and again, I've pointed this out, he doesn't respond after the first or the second sign, neither in speech nor in action that the narrator can tell us as a result of receiving the sign. Now, again, his actions to follow indicate to us that, yes, he has felt that assurance because he does move forward. Next, why does God even grant the sign? We can debate whether or not this is a legitimate practice, and that comes up. We can debate whether or not Gideon is merely trying to relate to God through his old worldview glasses or not. Still, it was God's prerogative to give the sign or not. God could have said, I've already shown you that I'm going to do this. Have I not said I will be with you? He doesn't do that. He gives the sign. One scholar says this: God did it because he intended to save Israel no matter what. God is fulfilling his promise to reach the Israelites and deliver them. It will be through Gideon, but he's going to deliver Israel through Gideon despite Gideon's own unbelief. He's not going to let, as the author said, Gideon's unbelief derail his plans. Maybe, but we do see him granting the sign. We do know, as we've mentioned already, Abraham bartering with God over Sodom in Genesis 8. Later in the book of Judges, we'll see Jephthah make a vow to God about what he'll give to God after victory. But he doesn't do anything beforehand. He doesn't make a request beforehand. We can look at other signs. God is meeting Gideon where he is, and this is Gideon's episode. Or I should say it this way, and the Gideon episode is not over yet. There's still more to come. Those are some things to think about. But what about other questions that will lead to issues of application? Let me make this point. I've already made it, and we've dealt with this in the past with regard to Old Testament and New Testament historical narrative. This is a historical narrative, okay? It does pose a challenge for us, and it also raises many questions regarding application. As we've said, the author is merely reporting at this point what Gideon did. The author does not give us any kind of positive or negative commentary as to whether this was good or bad. We need to recognize that first and foremost, when we read ancient narrative, it is first descriptive. Now, that doesn't mean it's only descriptive, but it's first descriptive. And we should say it this way: all history is descriptive. From that point on, then we have to determine what is being described. We have to determine whether what is being described is something that we should emulate or avoid or just accept as having taken place. The biggest place that we have that issue, of course, in the New Testament is with the book of Acts. Paul, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 15, without expressing positive or negative one way or the other, reports the fact that people baptize for the dead because Jesus rose from the dead and they believe in resurrection. One religious group in our world today, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, actually has a practice of baptizing for the dead because of that verse in chapter 15. But Paul is not affirming it. He's not explaining it. He's not describing it. He just says they do it because they believe in the resurrection. We have a number of other texts throughout the Bible that we have to determine. Do we go from description to prescription? As I said, this text is already descriptive, but now we have to ask ourselves, how do we discern such a description or a descriptive narrative as also being prescriptive? As we said at the beginning of the lesson, many do put out a fleece to seek God's wisdom because Gideon did it. What clues are there then that would make this a prescriptive text? And what should we expect? So for your thought before a conclusion drawn in a minute, let me ask you this. How do we discern, as we've reiterated, how do we discern that a descriptive narrative is merely descriptive or that it can also be prescriptive? What clues are there so that what clues are there in this text, as I should say, that lead to either conclusion? We need to ask that question. You may not be satisfied with where we're going with all of this, but I want to point out some implications to this as we go forward. First, what arguments can be made for us putting out a fleece today? I put putting out a fleece in air quotes, okay? Because we use that terminology because of this text. What arguments can be made for the practice of putting out a fleece? In other words, on what basis is this an acceptable practice? Again, the text reports it. The question is, what in the text indicates this is a good thing or that it's something we should emulate? What principle of interpretation do you employ to arrive at that conclusion? Now, I bring that up not to be negative toward anybody, but I think it's important that we do that. It comes up with any text. Why is it that we do this but not this? We know that the text says this. Sometimes the text actually teaches something to do or not to do, but because we're under the new covenant, we're not required to do that anymore, or we're actually prohibited from doing that. We don't offer sacrifices. Jesus was sacrificed once for all. What are some principles of interpretation? So it may be a question you've not considered before. If you do practice this, what is your basis for practicing it other than you see Gideon doing it? There are others that would suggest not. So that leads me to the next question. What arguments can be made against, quote, putting out a fleece? We still have to ask the same question. What in the text may be a clue one way or the other? If there is a case then to be made for a possible application of this text, in other words, if putting out a fleece is an acceptable way to inquire of God, many more things have to be considered. When you're talking about applying a text from the Old Testament or the New Testament historical narrative, we have to think of a lot of things that are in play. So let me run down about 8 questions to consider. How much of our situation or a situation must line up with the situation being presented in the narrative for it to be permissible or prescriptive? That's a general statement at first. But one of the things we have to think about when it comes to applying a biblical text is we are in the same situation. I say that with regard to prophecy. Whenever we find ourselves in the same situation as the prophet speaking to the situation in the Old Testament, we know that all things considered being under Jesus' blood in the new covenant, God's attitude toward us is the same as it was toward the people committing those sins. So we know that when there is a parallel like that, it can apply. When we look at a narrative like this, then, how much of our situation must line up with the historical situation for there even be the possibility of direct application? Some of those questions come into play as we look forward. So I just want that general question up front. How much of a or our situation must line up with the situation being presented in the narrative for it to be permissible and prescriptive for us? Number 2, above we said Gideon was basically a new believer. Does that mean this practice is acceptable for new Christians only? Because he is a new believer. God is somewhat giving into that, if you will. And he's working with Gideon where he is now to move him forward. Remember, the first words out of the angel of the Lord's mouth were, do not be afraid. The Lord is with you, warrior, valiant warrior, or mighty warrior. But he's not there yet. He's going to be there. But we're dealing with someone who's basically brand new. How long then before it is not permissible or that it is ill-advised for someone to seek a sign from God with regard to his will? Is there anything in the text that is suggestive here? Number 3, in this situation, Gideon is going to battle. What possible parallel circumstances are there today for us, either individually or as a people, that we might seek God's sign for this? He's going into battle. He's facing a difficult situation. He's asking God for a sign. And then he prescribes to God what that sign will be. Number 4, Gideon was already given a call and commission by God, and he was given assurance of that with a previous sign. Both words and sign was given for Gideon to know that God was going to be with him. He has a word about God's presence with him and assurance of victory. So Gideon was not seeking God's will. He already knew God's will. He was seeking assurance of victory. He said, I will, as you said, bring victory for Israel. One of the things I will say at this point is many times people who do put out a fleece are asking God's will. But Gideon was told God's will, confirmed with a sign that there will be victory. And now he's asking for more signs. Does this text teach that it's okay to ask for verification after a clear expression of God's will has been given? Side question, what do we have today that Gideon didn't have? That maybe God was more open to him asking for a sign. But we have to think about these parallels and look at the text very closely. Number 5, that there are 2 requests made. Does that mean we should make 2 requests? Or is there a limit? Do we stop after 1? Do we keep going through 5? There were 2 requests. More about the requests in a moment. But the question is, how closely are we going to follow this text? If we're going to use it as prescriptive, then where's the cutoff? Number 6, the first request was easy. It was just a natural outcome. He asked for something that would be typical. Now, the timing of it would be important. Even if he were asking this of Baal, the timing is an issue here. We don't know exactly what time of the year it is that this moisture would be building up. That could have been first and foremost miraculous, but in many ways, this is a natural event. He asked the first time, it was an easy thing, a natural thing. He asked a second time, it was unnatural. It's not natural for the ground to be wet and something that absorbs liquid to be dry. So, should the request be made in that order, or a request in like manner? Have God do something that we know he can do, or that can be done naturally, and then ask the supernatural. Number 7, the request was a direct reference to Baal that we mentioned. In this case, the God whom Gideon was leaving. What would be the parallel there for us? Remember, we have to consider who Gideon is in his circumstances. Number 8, the sign employed a fleece. Should a fleece be used? On what basis is it to be understood as only analogy for us today, and that we would then ask for a sign for ourselves? On what would constitute then putting out a fleece? How does one determine what their fleece is going to be? I know people that say they put out a fleece, and it's interesting. Sometimes they say what it is, sometimes they don't. It's important to recognize these 8 questions. Indeed, many questions are being asked, but many more could be asked as well. How closely are you going to read the text and looking for whether or not this is the thing to do? And then how closely do you follow the actual pattern? There's much that is different in our life from what Gideon was going through. But let's take a look at some closing thoughts. K. Lawson Younger Jr. in his Zondervan Study Bible article says this, and I mentioned this already. Gideon is the first person in the Bible to request a sign from God. And it's also extremely rare. God does often give signs, but he initiates those. So we're dealing with a very exceptional situation here. There in the Zondervan Study Bible and in his NIV application commentary on Judges and Ruth, he quotes J.C. Exum, who says this: no character in the book receives more divine assurance than Gideon. yet none displays more doubt. We said this in the introduction in the introductory week of our study of Gideon, that we have more about Gideon than we have about many of the other judges. Obviously, there are more chapters on Samson later, but what we have in Gideon more than we have than any other judge in the book of Judges is the development of the relationship between Gideon and God. We've had all this dialogue. Okay, there's more to be said about that in a second. So he receives more assurance. He's already received assurance from words. Remember, God said that he is with him. He will be sending him. He is going to be present with him in battle. He gives him a sign. He's preserved him from being killed after destroying the temple or the altar of Baal. And now he's given him the two signs that he's requested. There will be another sign that will come in the ensuing chapter, and it's going to be one that God actually initiates on behalf of Gideon. Gideon receives more assurance, and yet Gideon displays more doubt than anyone else. Maybe it's because Gideon needed more assurance. Exum, the author I just mentioned, who was quoted in Younger, says this also. Gideon is significantly the only judge to whom God speaks directly, though this privilege does not allay his faint-heartedness. We do know that God has spoken to people, but he is using intermediaries. Here he's speaking to Gideon directly. He and many others then interpret Gideon's actions negatively. And as I said earlier, I looked at commentaries, I looked online, just different resources. It's almost universally agreed that what Gideon did was evidence of his lack of faith. It's not an action or an activity that we should emulate. Many cited Deuteronomy's prohibition of putting God to the test. That comes up. Others have, as I've mentioned also, Jesus and Paul's negative attitude towards people asking for a sign. In fact, Jesus, when requesting a sign that was demanding something to prove who he was, he did not give it. By all accounts, what Gideon did was not recorded for us to emulate. But here are some things that we can take away in conclusion. Let's talk first about Gideon. Through all of this, it must be stated that Gideon is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11's Hall of Faith. It is ironic that the four judges that are mentioned in the Hall of Faith are Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. One thing they all have in common, they did act in obedience after there were certain marks on their obedience. In other words, let me put it this way. Barak obeyed after seeking assurance of Deborah's presence with him. Gideon, who we know more about than any of these others in terms of their relationship with God, does obey. He's tearing down altars. He's building an army. He's going to go to battle. He is obedient. Jephthah, who's a mercenary of types and really not even loved by his own neighbor, his own clan and tribe, does act in obedience. And for Samson, for all of his problems, and he does pay the ultimate price in the end, he does act obediently at a certain time. They all act obediently. And maybe that's part of why they're in the Hall of Faith. I've said Deborah should be there, but I didn't write the book of Hebrews. There should be others, Othniel. But these are those who grew and developed in their faith, and they acted. And I think that can be something important. So we do see Gideon for all of his challenges that we can see, for all of the things we can criticize him for. The writer to the Hebrews says he was a man of faith. He acted in faith. Then what about God? We asked, why did God grant this? I think this demonstrates God's patience with Gideon. And somewhat I do agree with the author who says that God was going to work regardless of what Gideon was doing. He's not going to let Gideon's lack of faith keep him from fulfilling his purpose for Israel at that point. I think there's some truth to that in this sense, that God does act patiently working through Gideon, because the thing is, he called Gideon. And so Gideon was going to be the one to help deliver the Israelites. And so he was working with Gideon along the way. I think it does show his grace. To whatever extent this was a warranted action on his part, Gideon in requesting that sign, God graciously does grant that request. We do then see God walking alongside Gideon to increase his faith, and God, as we said, helping Gideon to become what he already declared Gideon was. His first words were mighty warrior, and we start to see him growing in that regard. Something to consider. Excuse me, something for us to consider. I asked about asking for signs earlier in our lesson. Let me bring it back to the end. If you have ever put out a fleece seeking a sign from God, this is not me giving condemnation of that. You did it with good intentions. You had motives, the right motives, just as Gideon did. And sometimes we're doing it just because we know Gideon did it without actually reflecting upon whether it's something we should emulate. So I don't criticize that. But there is reason to question that doing so is the means by which we are to get answers from God, though. We have other means by which we can get answers from God. We have what Gideon didn't. We have the Bible. We have many, many more mature people around us. Gideon had no one. We also have the Holy Spirit. In the moment that this is taking place in Gideon's life, he has been enveloped by the Holy Spirit, but he didn't have the permanent indwelling of the Holy Spirit in his life. God did grant Gideon's request. Again, that's not an endorsement of the process, or, if I can use this, it's not a sign for us either that the Bible is teaching us to do the same thing. And hopefully you'll be gracious in forgiving the pun there. We do need to recognize that in the context, Gideon was already told what God's will was. He wasn't seeking God's will. He was seeking affirmation of God's will. And that might be the way you've done it. You've looked at God, you've seen this is what he said to do. There's some fear on your part, perhaps, and you ask for reassurance. I don't know that this is the best activity to do, though. What we have witnessed then in this text is one person's journey of faith. We'll continue that journey moving forward. We're going to see Gideon putting his faith into practice. He's going to grow in that faith. And we'll see something, I think, rather ironic in the next couple of lessons moving forward that may be a response to this act of asking God for signs in order to get assurance from God that he is going to keep the promises that he made to Gideon. Well, let's stop there. I want to keep you thinking. I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this idea of putting out a fleece. I've asked all the questions. You can go back and rewatch. And I just want to challenge you to continue to seek God in all that he is seeking for you. I want to close with a word of prayer. And then as we get started to conclude, we'll come back and talk about next week's lesson. Father, we thank you for this day. We pray you help us to wrestle with your word, to know when we should take what the word describes as happening and actually do what is being described, and when we should take the description merely as what was done, and then look at the big picture of what you did in that regard and in that situation. We do want to be obedient to you. We certainly believe in you, and we do often recognize, like Gideon, that we do lack faith and we do seek reassurance. There are many times when we struggle knowing your will for our lives. In those moments that we do, I pray you help us to be confident in you and to know that you are going to be with us in all that you have promised that you will do in our lives. I pray that if anything, you'll help us to see the need for faith and that you'll continue to give us the faith we need. Lord, we worship you now. We praise you. Ask that you will guide us in all that we do. Pray that you will continue to increase our faith. Maybe this is Gideon's moment of, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, as the man said with Jesus. Lord, I do pray you will walk with us daily to increase our faith, to grow our relationship with you, and to continue to seek you on your terms and worship you in the way that you deserve and desire. You're a good God. We worship you and bless you. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, as we look at next week's lesson, let's go through that real quickly. Real quick reminder, what we've been looking at up to this point has all been taking place in the context of the Jezreel Valley. Also, I want to remind you that if you would like, you can go online and look at further studies of the life of Gideon. You can see the web address there from Dr. Claude Maritini's website. But if you want, you can go and look at the link that I've posted in the description below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're watching through Facebook, the description will be above the video itself. I do suggest you read those. They're very insightful. Also, as we mentioned, there are links in his blog to sermons from his pastor on the life of Gideon as well. Well, next week, we're going to be looking at Judges chapter 7, verses 1 through 11, the selflessness of the conquering. And what we're going to be seeing in that moment, in that text, is going to be another lesson for Gideon regarding what God's plan for him is. We will learn who will actually comprise the Israelite army. If you recall the story, then you know it won't be all those who showed up when Gideon called out for them. We'll just leave it at that. We'll just look forward to the next step in our journey with Gideon and his walk with God and his fulfilling God's purposes in his life. With that said, until our next lesson, I pray that you will be well and that you will be blessed.